In October 1947, a U.S. Army doctor named Edwin Hill delivered a classified report to the Pentagon describing data pulled from experiments on living human beings, prisoners who had been frozen alive, infected with plague, and cut open without anesthesia. Hill's conclusion was not that the scientists who ran those experiments should face prosecution. His conclusion was that the data could not be obtained in our own laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation, and that the men responsible should be spared embarrassment. Not one of them was ever charged with a war crime. This is the story of Unit 731, Japan's industrial-scale biological warfare and human experimentation program, and the deliberate decision by the United States government to bury it. Shiro Ishii entered the world on June 25, 1892, in Chiyoda Village, Chiba Prefecture, born the fourth son of a wealthy landowning family whose grip on the surrounding area was, by all accounts, close to feudal. The Ishii household controlled local rice and sake production and occupied exactly the kind of position in rural Japan that opened doors, the best schools, the most ambitious careers, the right connections at every stage. Graduating from Kyoto Imperial University Medical School in 1920, Ishii married the daughter of the university president that same year, a move that announced both his ambitions and his talent for placing himself where power lived. Classmates remembered him as brash and physically imposing, reportedly close to 6 feet tall, with a booming voice and a memory so freakish he could reproduce entire textbooks from a single reading. Arrogance was not a trait Ishii tried to manage. It was the engine. One story circulated widely within the Imperial Japanese Army and appears in multiple historical accounts. To demonstrate a water purification filter he had designed and patented, Ishii reportedly urinated into it and offered the filtered liquid to the emperor. When the emperor declined, Ishii drank it himself. Whether the story is precise in every detail, it captures something exact about the man. Spectacular, theatrical, self-validating, built entirely around the project of making Shiro Ishii impossible to ignore. Starting in 1927, Ishii spent 2 years touring Europe and the United States, studying military medicine, post-war sanitation programs, and the wreckage left by World War I's chemical warfare campaigns. What he carried back home was not revulsion. It was a conclusion. His reasoning ran like this. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had banned biological and chemical weapons, which meant, Ishii decided, that they must be worth banning. When the great powers agree in writing to prohibit something, that something must work. Ishii also noticed that the United States had signed the protocol but had not yet ratified it, and that detail lodged somewhere in his thinking. By the early 1930s, Ishii had built a coalition of patrons inside the Imperial Japanese Army that read like a who's who of the military establishment. Army Minister Sadao Araki was in. Colonel Chikahiko Koizumi, who would go on to serve as Japan's health minister from 1941 to 1945, was in. Nagata Tetsuzan, a leader of the Army's dominant control faction, added his weight. These were not peripheral supporters. They were the infrastructure of military power, and they backed Ishii's project from the beginning. Koizumi's involvement carries a particular edge worth sitting with. For the entire duration of Japan's Pacific War, the man whose job it was to protect the nation's public health was a founding patron of a program simultaneously murdering prisoners in industrial quantities. By 1932, the Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory had been formally established at the Army Military Medical School in Tokyo, and Japan's biological warfare program had a home. What followed over the next 13 years would become the largest state-sanctioned human experimentation operation in recorded history. The program's first physical home in Manchukuo was called Joma Fortress, built near Bayan, roughly 100 kilometers south of Harbin. Construction started around 1932, and the Chinese laborers who built it were reportedly killed when the work was done. The first of a pattern that would define the program's entire history, where the need for secrecy was satisfied by eliminating anyone who might break it. 3-meter earthen walls topped with electrified barbed wire surrounded the compound, which held capacity for up to 1,000 prisoners according to some accounts. though the number in active use at any given time ran considerably lower. The surrounding village of Bayan, roughly 300 homes, built over generations, was forcibly cleared and razed. Then the experiments began. Prisoners at Zhongma arrived well-fed, and that detail is worth pausing on. Adequate nutrition at intake was not mercy. Ishii's program required subjects in baseline physiological health so that what followed could be measured accurately. A starving, diseased subject was a contaminated data point. What followed the initial period of adequate nutrition was systematic destruction, plague inoculation, frostbite induction, blood extraction of 500 cubic centimeters at 2 to 3 day intervals calibrated to the edge of the body's ability to replenish, and vivisection, surgical procedures on living, conscious subjects to examine organ condition before decomposition could alter the picture. Former guards at Bayan described one method for extracting brain samples. A guard would strike the subject's skull with an axe to crack it open. Zhongma Fortress did not survive long enough to become what Ishii had in mind. A prisoner escape in late 1934 compromised secrecy. A suspected sabotage explosion in 1935 finished it. Ishii shut the site down and started planning the replacement. What he had run at Zhongma was a proof of concept. What he built next was the factory. The decision to abandon Zhongma and construct Pingfang follows a logic that anyone familiar with industrial development would recognize. You validate the core methodology at small scale, in a controllable and deniable environment. Then you build the purpose-built production facility once you know the concept holds. Zhongma was the minimum viable product. Pingfang was the factory that proof of concept made possible. And the only real difference between the two was the scale of what could be processed. Emperor Hirohito's 1936 decree authorized the expansion of Japan's biological warfare program and formally embedded it in the Guandong Army structure. That same decree brought Unit 100 into existence as a parallel animal disease and biological weapons operation and authorized the chemical weapons work that would eventually produce Unit 516. Lieutenant General Kajitsuka Ruji later testified at the Khabarovsk trial that Ishii had obtained permission for the Pingfang experiments by command of the emperor, and that testimony has never been contradicted by any documentary evidence. Construction at Pingfang began in 1936 on land that had supported 10 combined villages. The Guandong Army seized the territory, compensated the displaced farmers at rates local accounts describe as deliberately inadequate, and designated the whole zone a special military zone. Unauthorized aircraft entering the airspace could be shot down. Civilians who approached the perimeter faced armed guards. From the moment it opened, Pingfang was a closed world with its own rules. The cover story offered to the outside was that Pingfang was a lumber mill. That is where the word Maryuta comes from. Maryuta means logs in Japanese. The prisoners held inside were called logs. The mill processed them. When the complex reached full operation, it covered approximately 6 square kilometers and contained around 150 separate structures, housing roughly 3,000 permanent staff. Pingfang had its own railway siding extending 4 kilometers from the main line, its own airfield with an attached aviation unit, animal incinerators, a library, dormitories called Togo Village, a brothel, a Shinto shrine, warehouses, and administrative offices, along with its own electricity generation, water system, and internal communications. At the core sat the row prison blocks, built with thick concrete walls and soundproofed, because what happened inside those blocks produced sounds that could not be permitted to carry. Ishii's personal arrangements at Pingfang were not those of a man living in wartime austerity. He commuted to the complex by limousine and kept a residence in a sequestered Russian-style mansion in Harbin, where he lived with his wife and 7 children. His brother Mitsuo Ishii served as prison warden, ensuring that the flow of information between the experimental blocks and the outside world stayed tightly controlled. The equipment supply contract went to a company called Neon Takushu Kogyo, which held its monopoly through a kickback arrangement that paid Ishii directly. The annual budget ran approximately 10 million yen per year, with modern equivalents ranging into the tens of millions of dollars depending on the conversion method used. This was not a black site operation sustained by scraps. It was a fully funded, institutionally supported, bureaucratically administered weapons program drawing on the treasury of the Japanese Empire, supervised by officers whose authority derived from imperial decree. The facility was divided into 8 formal divisions. Division 1 ran bacteriological research on plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and tuberculosis using living human subjects. Division 2 developed delivery systems for biological agents. Division 3 produced biological shells and munitions. The remaining divisions handled logistics, animal breeding, training, and aerial dispersal. According to Major General Kawashima Kiyoshi's testimony at the 1949 Khabarovsk war crimes trial, Pingfong's monthly production capacity reached up to 300 kilograms of plague bacteria, 1,000 kilograms of cholera, 800 to 900 kilograms of typhoid, and 500 to 700 kilograms of anthrax. Those were not theoretical figures. They represent the operational throughput of a functioning biological weapons production facility running at scale. Prisoners. The Maryuta came almost entirely through the Kinpitai, the Imperial Military Police, at a rate of approximately 600 per year through what internal documents called special transfers. Black windowless vans with a single ventilation hole transported them to the facility. Inside Unit 731, each prisoner received a number and stopped being a person. Archival research has identified 1,463 individuals sent to Pingfong as special transfers, of whom 318 have been named. The named group includes 25 from the Soviet Union, Korea, and Mongolia. The rest were overwhelmingly Chinese, with Morimura's research placing the proportion at roughly 70% Chinese and 30% other nationalities. No prisoner who passed through the Pingfong experimental system is known to have survived. One account, given by a former unit member to the New York Times in 1995 and cited in multiple subsequent histories, describes being present during a vivisection. A subject who had been infected with disease was still alive when the medical staff opened him from the chest to the stomach. What the former member recalled was this. The man screamed terribly, his face twisted in agony, and then eventually he stopped. Medical staff continued working. That former member said he could not forget the sound. A young man, when he was assigned to Unit 731, he gave that interview 50 years after the war ended. He had never been charged with anything. The experiments conducted at Pingfong between approximately 1936 and 1945 were not incidental atrocities committed by soldiers who had lost control. They were systematic, categorized, recorded, and in many cases published, with the origins of the data concealed but the conclusions presented as ordinary research findings. Biological infection ran through everything. Subjects were exposed to plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, typhus, tuberculosis, glanders, and other pathogens through injection into the bloodstream, contamination of food and water, application to open wounds, and direct inhalation. The goal was not simply killing. Researchers were studying how diseases progressed under controlled conditions, how the body responded to different pathogen loads, and which strains killed most effectively and spread most readily. The most lethal strains were selected through a process called passaging. Blood drawn from the most severely infected subjects was used to infect the next group, amplifying virulence with each cycle. Applied to plague specifically, passaging generated strains of extraordinary lethality for field deployment. One incident during plague production illustrates what the operational environment actually looked like. A Japanese unit member named Yoshio Sudo became accidentally infected. He was not evacuated for treatment. His colleagues vivisected him, and his data was recorded alongside the data from the prisoners. Frostbite research was directed by physiologist Yoshimura Hisato, known inside the unit as the Scientific Devil. Yoshimura exposed subjects' limbs and, in some cases, entire bodies to extreme cold, inducing frostbite under controlled conditions, then testing rewarming methods to determine which worked best for soldiers injured in winter combat. An extremity was considered adequately frozen when, struck with a stick, it produced a sound witnesses described as similar to hitting a plank of wood. Rewarming tests used boiling water, open flame, and body heat applied to limbs that were in many cases already necrotic. Witness Naoji Uezono described two naked men left in conditions of -40 to -50 degrees and filmed until they died. In 1950, Yoshimura published an article in the Japanese Journal of Physiology acknowledging the use of approximately 20 children and a 3-day-old infant in ice and saltwater experiments. That article appeared in a legitimate scientific journal. It was cited in subsequent Japanese cold-weather medicine literature. Yoshimura went on to found the Japanese Society of Biometeorology and held senior academic positions for the remainder of his career. He was never charged. Pressure chamber experiments subjected subjects to rapid depressurization, simulating the effects of altitude on aircraft crew and documenting the physiological threshold at which the human body fails. Witnesses described subjects whose eyes were forced from their sockets by the pressure differential. Centrifuge experiments spun subjects at escalating speeds until cardiac or neurological failure. Air injected directly into bloodstreams induced embolism. Subjects were hung upside down for extended periods to establish how long the body could survive inverted. At the outdoor testing grounds in Anda, roughly 200 kilometers from Pingfang, prisoners were bound to posts and exposed to flamethrowers at measured distances. Explosive devices went off at varying ranges to document blast radius, burn depth, and fragment penetration. Gas chambers delivered blister agents and nerve agents under observation. In late 1943, according to Major Karasawa Tomio's testimony at Khabarovsk, approximately 10 living prisoners were tied to wooden posts spaced 5 meters apart, and a bomb engineered to disperse disease-infected fragments was detonated approximately 50 meters away. That single test combined weapons performance measurement with biological dispersal in one operation. Surgery without anesthesia removed the chemical variable that anesthesia would have introduced into the data. Rags or gauze went into subjects' mouths to absorb the sounds they produced. The medical staff operated. Blood drainage extracted approximately 500 cubic centimeters at 2 to 3 day intervals, calibrated to the body's regenerative threshold until the circulatory system gave out. Male subjects infected with syphilis were ordered to engage in sexual contact with other subjects to study transmission rates. Women who became pregnant were then infected with experimental agents and vivisected to examine fetal response. X-ray experiments exposed subjects to radiation doses far beyond any therapeutic level, establishing the lethality curve, a graph plotting radiation exposure against time to incapacitation and time to death. A lethality curve requires enough separate deaths at enough separate dosage levels to produce a statistically meaningful line. Each point on that curve was a person. Starvation and dehydration studies ran alongside other experiments simultaneously. Frostbite subjects were also dehydrated. Plague-infected subjects were also food-deprived. The research question was not simply how long the body survives without water. The question was how water deprivation changes the rate at which a plague-infected prisoner dies. Compound experiments went further still. A single prisoner might carry a dysentery infection, a water deficit, a frostbitten limb, and a 2-day blood drainage schedule at the same time, so that researchers could study multiple physiological stressors interacting in parallel. The subjects were not material for one research question. They were platforms running multiple programs at once. Here is something that receives almost no attention in standard coverage of Unit 731, but goes to the heart of what the program actually was. Pingfang had a library. A well-maintained, regularly updated scientific library. The researchers subscribed to international medical journals and read the same papers as their counterparts at the Rockefeller Institute in New York, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and the Institut Pasteur in Paris. They cited sources. Some of their own papers ran in legitimate Japanese medical journals under their real names, without disclosing where the data came from, but presenting the conclusions as ordinary research. What happened at Pingfang was not mad science operating outside the norms of medicine. It was legitimate science, rigorous, methodical, institutional science, operating outside the norms of humanity. The methods were scientific. The ethics were absent, and the absence was not accidental. It was policy. That distinction matters because it removes the most comfortable explanation for what happened there, that the perpetrators were aberrant, deranged, unrecognizable as medical professionals. They were none of those things. They were physicians, trained at legitimate institutions, reading legitimate literature, applying legitimate methodology to research questions that had been stripped of the one constraint that makes research ethical: the requirement that subjects consent to participate and survive. Once that constraint was removed, the science ran normally. That is the most disturbing fact about Unit 731. Not that the experiments were conducted by monsters. They were conducted by doctors. Research those doctors produced was published. It was read. Readers of those journals had no way of knowing that the frostbite tolerance data they were reviewing had been generated by freezing children in ice water until they died. The total number killed inside Pingfang's experimental system cannot be stated with precision. At least 3,000 represents the scholarly consensus floor, the minimum figure supported by the weight of peer-reviewed historical research and by Sheldon Harris's framework in Factories of Death. Former unit member Okawa Fukamatsu put the number at least at 10,000. Harris himself estimated 10,000 to 12,000. Some more recent sources cite 14,000. Nobody knows with precision, because the records were destroyed in August 1945 on direct orders. The witnesses were bound to silence by threat and institutional loyalty, and the investigators who might have fixed a definitive number were told by their government not to look too carefully. What is not in dispute? For every prisoner who entered the roadblocks of Pingfang, no return journey is documented. The operational purpose of the Maruta system was consumption. The prisoners were consumed. Pingfang was the hub, but the Japanese biological warfare program ran through a network of at least 6 major subordinate units spread across occupied China, Southeast Asia, and Manchukuo, with a combined operational strength exceeding 20,000 personnel. Unit 100, based in Changchun and sometimes called Mokotan, carried an official designation as the Guangdong Army's Warhorse Disease Prevention Facility. Its stated mandate covered equine diseases, relevant for an army that still depended heavily on horses. Its actual mandate included human experimentation and the development of biological agents to destroy enemy livestock, contaminate water, and disrupt agricultural production. Several of Unit 100 senior officers stood among the 12 defendants at Khabarovsk in 1949, where General Otozo Yamada, who commanded the Guangdong Army, received the maximum sentence of 25 years. Unit 516, based in Qiqihar, handled chemical weapons development and testing for the Guangdong Army, running experiments on prisoners inside glass observation chambers where the effects of atomsite gas and other agents could be documented. Unit 516 sometimes worked alongside Unit 731, combining chemical and biological approaches on the same subject. When the Guangdong Army evacuated Manchuria in August 1945, Unit 516 left behind chemical munitions that have been causing deaths in China ever since. Japanese government estimates place the number of abandoned munitions at approximately 700,000. Chinese government estimates run considerably higher, approaching 2 million. These weapons are still being discovered and accidentally detonated in China in the 21st century. Unit 1644, the Tami unit in Nanjing, functioned as a forward bacteria production facility for the Central Program and participated directly in the field biological attacks of 1940 and 1942. The unit's commander, Tomasada Masuda, was interviewed by U.S. investigator Norbert Fell in 1947 and described, apparently without recognizing how self-incriminating the information was, how one of his dysentery-infected subjects had hanged himself in his cell. Masuda's description was not remorseful. It was operational. The subject had been lost before the experiment reached its conclusion. Unit 8604, operating out of Sun Yat-sen University's medical campus in Guangzhou, maintained a rat breeding operation producing approximately 10,000 rats per month for plague flea production. The unit also ran waterborne typhus experiments and food and water deprivation studies on refugees at the Nanchita camp, people displaced by the war who found themselves in a facility that treated their desperation as a research resource. American aircraft bombed and destroyed Unit 8604's rat breeding facilities on June 24, 1945. Unit 1855 operated in Beijing. Unit 9420 ran out of Singapore with approximately 1,000 personnel at Raffles College's medical campus, focusing on malaria and plague research. Unit 543 operated in Hailar. Across the full network, more than 20 distinct units covered the theater of Japanese occupation. The organizational architecture of that network is structurally identical to the hub-and-spoke supply chain used by modern global pharmaceutical manufacturers, a central research and development hub at Pingfang generating core scientific protocols and highest-grade pathogen strains, regional production facilities at Units 1644, 8604, and others manufacturing at scale for their geographic areas, and field delivery units operating at the tactical front lines. The information flows, the logistics structure, the hierarchical accountability, all of it mirrors the organizational logic of a multinational manufacturing operation. The product being manufactured and distributed was weaponized disease. The individuals at the end of the supply chain were prisoners and civilians. The organizational logic was flawless. The purpose was the opposite of medicine. Japan was the only nation in World War II to deploy biological weapons at operational scale against human populations, and the program did not wait long before moving from the laboratory to the field. The first confirmed combat use came in 1939 during the battles of Namenhen, the border conflict between Imperial Japanese and Soviet forces along the Mongolian-Manchurian frontier. Known in Soviet records as the Battles of Kok and Gol, it was a substantial military engagement. Japanese forces suffered heavy losses and were decisively repelled by a Soviet armored force under General Georgy Zhukov. Unit 731 personnel contaminated the Kok and Gol River and its tributaries with intestinal pathogens. The biological operations' tactical results were inconclusive. The battle ended in significant Japanese defeat. But the deployment happened, it was authorized at command level, and the concept had been tested in live combat conditions for the first time. The significance of Namenhen is often buried under the fact that Japan lost the battle. But the decision to employ biological weapons against an active adversary in a real military engagement, not against bound prisoners at Anda, but in combat, crossed a threshold that could not be uncrossed. After Namenhen, Unit 731 was not a laboratory operation with field ambitions. It was an active military component. On October 27, 1940, the program struck Ningbo. Aircraft operating from Hangzhou's Jianxiao airfield dropped plague-infected fleas mixed with wheat, corn, and cotton over a neighborhood called Kamingji. The flea and grain mixture was chosen deliberately. Materials common enough in a Chinese city that they would not immediately draw attention, giving the fleas time to spread before anyone understood what had been delivered. According to historical research attributed to Sheldon Harris, drawing on a 1994 survey by Dongnan University Press that named each victim individually, the Ningbo operation killed 106 Chinese civilians over the following 39 days. A separate Japanese military follow-up study examining what it called a second infection wave found approximately 1,450 total deaths. The difference between those two figures is not a counting dispute. It reflects a biological reality the planners at Pingfang understood and intended. Plague does not stop where you drop it. The initial deposit of infected fleas was the ignition. What followed as plague moved through the rat population and back to humans was the fire, and it continued burning long after the aircraft had returned to base. Ningbo's response illustrated the scale of terror the operation produced. Authorities built a 4.3-meter isolation wall around the entire Kamingji neighborhood and burned it to the ground, razing the whole Kaming Street district. With no effective antibiotic treatment for bubonic plague available in 1940, the wall and the fire were the only tools on hand. In 1941, A unit under Colonel Oda Kiyoshi struck Changde in Hunan province, dropping plague-infected fleas along with contaminated grain, cotton, and rice. The subsequent bubonic plague outbreak's death toll sits between two figures from researchers who examined the same general evidence. China Daily's 2015 reporting cited at least 7,600 deaths, while historian Daniel Barenblatt's regional tallies put the number above 10,400. Neither figure is definitive. What is not in dispute is that Changde experienced a deliberately initiated plague epidemic in 1941 that killed thousands. The largest single combined operation was the Zhujiang Jiangxi Campaign of 1942, designated Operation Saigo, running from May through September of that year. The trigger was the April 1942 Doolittle Raid. American B-25 bombers had struck Tokyo and then flown on to emergency landings at airfields in eastern China, where Chinese civilians and military units sheltered and assisted the crews. Japan's response was to systematically destroy those airfields and punish the population that had helped. The raid succeeded. The biological warfare component of Saigo was not incidental. Approximately 180,000 Imperial Japanese Army troops advanced through the Zhujiang-Jiangxi corridor, while biological warfare units spread cholera, typhoid, plague, dysentery, glanders, and anthrax across cities they occupied and then abandoned. Wells were contaminated before withdrawal. Food stores were infected. Aircraft made direct dispersal runs over population centers. The methodology was designed to leave behind a disease environment that would keep killing after the soldiers had moved on, striking Suzhou, Wenzhou, Taizhou, Yushan, and other cities across the region. And that's when something happened that the planners had not anticipated and that the program's defenders have never been able to explain away. Approximately 1,700 Imperial Japanese Army soldiers died from their own biological agents during the Saigo operation, primarily from cholera, which spread back through the advancing army's supply lines and rear areas without any interest in the color of a uniform. The standard historical treatment of the Zhujiang-Jiangxi campaign focuses on the conventional atrocities, the village destruction, the civilian massacres, the scorched earth advance. Those elements are documented and real, but they consistently draw attention away from what the biological warfare record shows plainly. Japan's biological weapons program was not a precision instrument operating under confident professional control. The agents that killed Chinese civilians killed Japanese soldiers. A 4-month campaign that produced 1,700 friendly fire fatalities from weapons its own army deployed is not a demonstration of strategic rationality. It is a demonstration of operational recklessness. The program continued anyway, and that tells us something specific about the relationship between institutional momentum and strategic thinking inside the Imperial Japanese Army's command structure in 1942. Beyond the confirmed operations, Unit 731 drew up attacks that were never executed but reveal the full scope of what Ishii's program was willing to attempt. Plans for biological attacks against the Bataan Peninsula in March 1942, involving approximately 150 million plague fleas in 10 separate operations, were not carried out. Plans for attacks against Saipan in 1944 went nowhere. The most ambitious, unexecuted plan came together in late March 1945. Ishii and his senior staff finalized what was designated Operation PX, sometimes referred to as Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan called for 5 submarines from the Imperial Navy's I-400 class, the largest submarines any nation had built at that point in the war, each carrying 3 Aichi M6 Asiran floatplanes, to approach the California coast. From there, the aircraft would fly to San Diego, Los Angeles, and San Francisco and release plague-infected fleas over those cities. September 22, 1945, was the planned launch date. Pilot Ishio Kabata later recalled being briefed directly by Ishii on the mission, which Kabata understood to be a suicide operation. The plan was vetoed by Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Yamizu, who reportedly believed it risked a retaliatory response. Japan surrendered 6 weeks before the launch date. Total casualties from Japanese biological warfare operations across China during the war years cannot be precisely stated. The 2002 International Symposium on the Crimes of Bacteriological Warfare, held in Chengde, produced an estimate of approximately 580,000 deaths from Japanese germ warfare and experiments. Sheldon Harris, using different methodology and scope, placed the figure at more than 200,000. Both estimates appear in serious scholarly literature. Both represent catastrophic numbers by any measurement. The question of whether Unit 731 conducted deliberate biological warfare experiments on captured American, British, or Australian prisoners has never been definitively settled, and the documentary record pulls in two directions that credentialed historians examining the same evidence have read very differently. The Mukden prisoner of war camp, known in Japanese records as Hoten Camp, sat in Manchuria approximately 560 kilometers from Pingfang. Its first large contingent of American prisoners arrived in November 1942, many of them survivors of the Bataan Death March who had already endured months of starvation, disease, tropical heat, and systematic brutality. They were not in good health when they arrived. Major Robert Peaty of the Royal Army Ordnance Corps served as the senior British officer at Mukden and kept a secret diary throughout his imprisonment, a document now held at the Imperial War Museum in London. 3 entries from the winter of 1942 to 1943 have driven the historical debate. On January 30th, 1943, Peaty recorded that every prisoner in the camp received a 5 cubic centimeter inoculation described as typhoid paratyphoid. On February 15, 1943, he recorded that Japanese medical personnel were conducting autopsies on American corpses. On February 23, 1943, he noted that 142 Americans had died in the preceding 5 days, and 186 in total over a short period. What those inoculations contained was never established through evidence that satisfies all historians. Linda Getz Holmes, a historian who served on the U.S. Interagency Working Group that declassified Japanese war crimes documents under the Japanese Imperial Government Disclosure Act of 2000, obtained what she describes as a military order from Japan's commanding general in Manchuria, directing a Unit 731 medical team to visit the Mukden camp. Holmes presents that order as proof that the inoculations were biological warfare experiments on American prisoners. Sheldon Harris reviewed the same general body of evidence in Factories of Death and reached the opposite conclusion. Harris acknowledged the deaths, the Japanese medical presence, and the inoculations, then concluded that the leap from those documented facts to confirm biological warfare experimentation on American prisoners was not supported by the available documentation. His overall judgment was that there was no substantive evidence to prove that the experiments took place at Camp Mukden. On June 7, 1947, Colonel Alva Carpenter, the chief legal officer in MacArthur's command, sent a cable expressing skepticism about early reports of experiments on Americans at Mukden. A subsequent document from the same command in August 1947 described the possibility of such experimentation as only remote. The responsible position here is to present both arguments clearly and refuse to flatten the uncertainty. Holmes documented a military order directing Unit 731 personnel to visit Mukden. Harris documented the absence of evidence establishing what those personnel did when they arrived. Neither argument disproves the other. Both are honest assessments of an incomplete record, and the reason the record is incomplete is partly because the U.S. government made decisions in 1945, 1946, and 1947 that closed off what could be known. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, 2 days after the first atomic bomb destroyed Hiroshima and 1 day before the second destroyed Nagasaki. Soviet armored columns drove into Manchuria at a pace the Guandong Army could not answer. The strategic situation in Manchukuo was finished in days. At Pingfang, orders came from Tokyo, destroy everything. The buildings of the complex, constructed to high Japanese military engineering standards, resisted quick demolition. Explosives were used. Incinerators that had previously processed human remains now processed documents. Ishii gathered his senior staff and issued the directive that would frame the next 14 years of his life. Every member of the unit was to take the secret to the grave. He threatened them, told them public disclosure meant prosecution and death, and barred them from public sector employment and instruction. Many of them ultimately ignored once the immunity deal was secured. The prisoners remaining in the roadblocks at the moment of evacuation, approximately 300 individuals by multiple accounts, were killed. Gassing and poisoning are the methods that appear in surviving accounts. The Chinese and Manchurian laborers who had worked at Pingfang throughout the war, approximately 600 people who knew the facility and understood what had happened there, were shot. Plague-infected animals were released into the surrounding Manchurian countryside. Whether those releases contributed to the plague outbreak that struck the Harbin area between 1946 and 1948, killing approximately 30,000 people according to Sheldon Harris's estimate, cannot be established with certainty because plague was endemic to the region before the war. The timing is notable. The causal link is contested. What is not contested is that the decision to release plague-infected animals before evacuating was made deliberately by people who understood precisely what plague-infected animals would eventually do to the human population living in the same territory. Ishii staged his own death. A funeral was held in his hometown of Chiyoda. The ritual was performed. Flowers were sent. Ishii was not in the coffin. Accounts place him near Kanazawa in the weeks that followed, not destitute, carrying approximately $1 million in cash gathered over years from the kickback arrangement with Neon Takushu Kogyo, along with approximately 8,000 microscope slides containing tissue samples from experimental subjects. Those slides represented the most scientifically specific product of the entire Pingfang operation. Ishii had been extracting them from the facility in the weeks before the Soviet advance made evacuation necessary. He knew what he was carrying, and he knew what it was worth, and he waited to see who would come looking. Japan surrendered formally on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri. Unit 731 ceased to exist as a physical facility. Buildings reduced to rubble or ash, prisoners dead, documents burned, plague-infected animals loose in the countryside. And the man who built all of it was alive, in hiding, in possession of the program's most valuable scientific materials, waiting to find out what they would bring. The first American dispatch to Japan with a specific mandate to investigate Japan's biological warfare program was Murray Sanders, a bacteriologist from Fort Detrick, Maryland, the U.S. Army's primary biological warfare research facility. Sanders landed in September 1945, within weeks of the surrender. Murray Sanders did not speak Japanese. The Army assigned him a translator, and the translator was Lieutenant Colonel Ryoichi Nato. Ryoichi Nato was a former member of Unit 731. He had been part of Ishii's network from the beginning. In the weeks before Sanders arrived, Nato had been involved in the internal Unit 731 discussions about how to manage the coming American investigations. His assignment to Sanders was not a bureaucratic accident. He was placed there to manage what Sanders received, filter what Sanders heard, and shape what Sanders concluded. In a 1983 interview, conducted nearly 4 decades after the events, Murray Sanders acknowledged that he had been deceived. He had spent weeks investigating Japan's biological warfare program through an interpreter who was himself a key figure in that program, and the recommendation he carried back to General Douglas MacArthur, that no individual involved in biological warfare should be prosecuted as a war criminal, had been produced through an investigation being actively managed by one of the perpetrators from the first day. MacArthur accepted the recommendation. A second investigator, Lieutenant Colonel Arvo Thompson, arrived and stayed through May 1946, pushing harder than Sanders had and running into the same wall. Ishii, when questioned directly about his program, reportedly told Thompson that biological warfare was inhumane and would defile the virtue and benevolence of the emperor. The man who had frozen children alive and vivisected plague victims described biological warfare as inhumane and walked out of the interview. The operational breakthrough, if that phrase can be applied without irony, came with Dr. Norbert Fell in 1947. Fell was more tenacious. He also carried an explicit and documented offer. He told his Japanese subjects that his investigation was to obtain scientific and technical data and was not concerned with war crimes. Sheldon Harris later called this Fell's immunity promise. The American investigation had stopped pretending to be about accountability and had become, openly, a commercial negotiation. What followed was a transaction. Fell received data, and his evaluation of that data was not glowing. He described the human subject material as offering only limited value, noting that the results were somewhat fragmentary because a sufficiently large number of subjects was not used. Read that sentence carefully. An American Army doctor had evaluated the murder of thousands of people, frozen to death, infected with plague, cut open while alive, and described the resulting data as limited in value because the sample size was insufficient. The final report landed on December 12, 1947. Authors were Dr. Edwin Hill, technical director at Fort Detrick, and pathologist Joseph Victor. They had received reports categorized as A for anthrax, G for glanders, and Q for plague, along with approximately 8,000 pathology slides and hundreds of color medical drawings documenting experimental procedures. Edwin Hill's conclusion, in his own words, in an official U.S. government document. Such information could not be obtained in our own laboratories because of scruples attached to human experimentation. It is hoped that the individuals who voluntarily contributed this information will be spared embarrassment because of it. Read that sentence again, because what it contains is the precise nature of the decision the United States made about Japan's biological warfare crimes. Edwin Hill, technical director of Fort Detrick, acknowledged explicitly that the information had been produced through human experimentation that American ethical standards would have prohibited. He acknowledged that the men who produced it had done something his own country's scruples would not permit. And his recommendation was not prosecution, not acknowledgement. His recommendation was that these men be protected from embarrassment, not from prosecution, from embarrassment. That document exists. It was classified for decades. It has been declassified. It sits in the American Archival Record. On May 6, 1947, General Douglas MacArthur sent a cable to Washington stating that additional data, possibly some statements from Ishii, probably can be obtained by informing Japanese involved that information will be retained in intelligence channels and will not be employed as war crimes evidence. MacArthur was not proposing a possible approach. The deal was already in motion. He was confirming it. Researcher Tsunaishi Kiichi, working from declassified USG, 2 military intelligence files, and publishing through the Asia-Pacific Journal, documented that the A, G, and Q reports were purchased with cash drawn from a secret U.S. Army fund. Fort Detrick spent approximately 250,000 yen between September 1945 and November 1948 acquiring Unit 731's experimental records. Those approximately 1,500 pages of reports are today held in the U.S. Library of Congress. Tsunaishi also documented that G2, U.S. military intelligence, had systematically overstated the scientific value of the Unit 731 data in internal reporting in order to protect its own secret funding arrangement. Fell's honest assessment, that the data was of limited scientific value, was contradicted and suppressed inside the American military bureaucracy because acknowledging limited value would have required explaining why secret funds had been spent acquiring it and why war crime prosecutions had been abandoned to get it. The cover-up required its own cover-up. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, ran from 1946 to 1948. In the entire transcript of those proceedings, Unit 731 appears exactly once. A passing reference to poisonous serums, entered in August 1946 by a Chinese prosecutor's assistant named Joseph Massey. The full Tokyo trial record names exactly one biological warfare victim, a man identified as Kang Tse-shang, who died of plague. Thousands of documented experiments, hundreds of field attacks, deaths ranging into the hundreds of thousands, and the most significant international war crimes tribunal in the Pacific Theater produced one name. That outcome was not an accident. It was a policy decision executed through institutional suppression, and it worked completely. The same United States government that was purchasing Unit 731's data through secret funds was simultaneously running the Tokyo Tribunal as the embodiment of international accountability. Both operations ran in parallel inside the same institution. The same MacArthur command that suppressed Unit 731 from the Tokyo proceedings also oversaw those proceedings. The architects of accountability and the architects of the cover-up were the same people, and they understood exactly what they were doing. The Cold War defense that has sometimes been offered for the immunity decision, that biological warfare data, even limited data, was worth keeping out of Soviet hands in 1947 and 1948, has a certain structural logic. But it does not survive the specific evidence about what was actually paid for and what was actually done with it. The data was assessed as of limited value by the lead U.S. investigator. G2 inflated that assessment to protect its own funding. The cover-up was not primarily about protecting strategically vital intelligence. It was about protecting the institutional arrangement that had acquired it. While the United States was purchasing Unit 731's data and managing its absence from the Tokyo trials, the Soviet Union was conducting a different kind of proceeding. The Khabarovsk war crimes trial opened on December 25, 1949, in the Soviet Far East. 12 defendants, all current or former Imperial Japanese Army officers connected to the biological warfare program, stood before the tribunal. All 12 entered guilty pleas. Verdicts came on December 30, 1949. General Otozo Yamada, who commanded the Guangdong Army and under whose authority both Unit 731 and Unit 100 had operated, received the maximum sentence of 25 years. Lieutenant General Kajitsuka Ruji, who testified that Ishii had obtained permission for the ping-pong experiments by command of the emperor, received 25 years. Lieutenant General Takahashi Takaotsu received 25 years. Major General Kawashima Kiyoshi, whose testimony produced the monthly biological agent production figures, received 25 years. Major Karasawa Tomio, who testified in detail about the ANDA open-air human tests, received 18 years. Other defendants received sentences ranging from 12 years down to 2, with lighter sentences reflecting lesser degrees of direct participation. The lead prosecutor was Lev Smirnov, who had served as a Soviet prosecutor at Nuremberg. Proceedings were conducted with the formal apparatus of a military tribunal, and the confessions were detailed, specific, and consistent across defendants. Washington's official response was to characterize the Khabarovsk trial as communist propaganda. The State Department and the Pentagon dismissed the confessions as coerced statements extracted under duress, and the Western press followed that framing closely. Here is what the subsequent historical record established. The Khabarovsk confessions were factually accurate. Kawashima Kiyoshi's testimony about monthly production figures: 300 kilograms of plague, 1,000 kilograms of cholera, 800 to 900 kilograms of typhoid, 500 to 700 kilograms of anthrax, was not contradicted by any American investigation and aligned with what American investigators had been trying to obtain. Karasawa Tomio's testimony about the ANDA outdoor tests was corroborated by accounts collected independently in entirely different contexts. Yamada's testimony about the command structure and Emperor Hirohito's 1936 decree was consistent with what Kajitsuka had separately stated. The confessions were not identical copies of each other, which would have signaled scripting. They were individual accounts from different perspectives that converged on the same underlying facts, and that is what genuine testimony looks like. The Soviet trial was presented to the Western public as propaganda. The evidence shows it was the closest thing to an honest official accounting that the international community ever produced for Unit 731's crimes. Washington called it propaganda because acknowledging its accuracy would have required acknowledging why there was no equivalent American prosecution, and why the men named in the Khabarovsk confessions were, at that moment, quietly returning to Japanese academic and professional life with American acquiescence. The propaganda characterization was not an assessment of evidence. It was a defensive response to the embarrassment of being shown, by a Soviet tribunal, what the American investigation had been paid to ignore. All surviving Khabarovsk defendants were repatriated to Japan by 1956. Karasawa Tomio, who had provided some of the most specific testimony about the Anda-human experiments, died in Soviet custody in 1956 under circumstances that suggest suicide. Sentences that began at 25 years ended, through early release and repatriation, at approximately 6 or 7 years of actual imprisonment. That leniency suggests a parallel arrangement to what the Americans had implemented. Information exchanged for reduced consequence. Both sides, it appears, extracted what they needed from the defendants and then released them. Both sides used the perpetrators as sources. Neither side put them in the ground. Shiro Ishii died on October 9, 1959, in Shinjuku, Tokyo, at 67 years old, from cancer of the larynx. 14 years had passed since the war ended. He had lived those years in a country that made no effort to prosecute him, surrounded by colleagues who shared his secret and his immunity. His daughter Harumi stated publicly that her father had converted to Catholicism near the end of his life and died in peace. She also stated that Ishii had been unjustly condemned by history. He had never been charged with anything. The funeral was chaired by Masaji Kitano, Ishii's successor as commander of Unit 731 from 1942 onward. In 1959, the year Ishii died, Kitano became chief director of a pharmaceutical company called Green Cross. Masaji Kitano died in Tokyo in 1986. Green Cross had been co-founded in 1950 by Ryoichi Nato, the same man who had served as Murray Sanders' translator in 1945 and spent those months ensuring the American investigator understood as little as possible about what the program had done. Nato established Japan Blood Bank in 1950, renamed it Green Cross, and chaired the company until his death in 1982. Murray Sanders, the bacteriologist who had been deceived by Nato in 1945 and recommended immunity on the basis of that deceived investigation, reportedly later served as a consultant to Green Cross. The investigator who enabled the immunity deal became a professional associate of the man who had deceived him into enabling it. Green Cross grew into one of Japan's largest pharmaceutical and blood products companies. In the 1980s, Green Cross distributed blood clotting products to Japanese hemophiliacs that had not been heat-treated to eliminate viral contamination. Heat treatment to inactivate HIV and hepatitis C had been developed by the early 1980s and was being implemented by other manufacturers. Green Cross continued distributing unheated products. By the time the scandal fully surfaced, at least 1,800 Japanese hemophiliacs, out of approximately 4,500 nationwide, had been infected with HIV through Green Cross blood products. Approximately 400 to 500 died from AIDS-related complications. 3 former Green Cross presidents were subsequently convicted of professional negligence resulting in death. Renzo Matsushita received 2 years, Tadakazu Suyama received 18 months, and Takehiko Kawano received 16 months. The company that former Unit 731 commanding officers built, and that a former Unit 731 officer chaired for 3 decades, infected and killed Japanese civilians with contaminated blood products 40 years after the war ended. There is no tidy word for what that represents. The post-war careers of other documented Unit 731 personnel follow a pattern that is not an abstraction about impunity, but a documented fact about named individuals in specific institutional roles. Hajime Uemura, who worked in the anthrax division at Pingfong, became a chief investigator at Japan's Ministry of Education, the ministry responsible for approving school history textbooks. The man who had worked on weaponizing anthrax went on to hold institutional authority over what Japanese schoolchildren were taught about the war. Mineo Nagatomo became vice governor of Hokkaido. Shiro Kasahara became vice director of the Kitasato Institute, one of Japan's most respected public health research bodies. Takeamaru Ishikawa joined the medical department at Kanazawa University. Multiple former unit members took positions at the National Institute of Infectious Diseases, the government body responsible for identifying and responding to disease outbreaks in Japan. Former members of a program that had deliberately produced epidemic disease for use as a weapon were subsequently employed in the institutions responsible for managing natural outbreaks of disease. Masami Kitaka had served at Unit 1644 in Nanjing. After the war, Kitaka joined Japan's National Institute of Health and, between 1947 and 1956, while employed as a government health scientist with institutional access and official credibility, continued to infect unwilling Japanese civilian subjects with rickettsia and typhus pathogens. Human experimentation on Japanese citizens, without consent, inside a government health institution, for nearly a decade after the war had ended and the immunity deal had been concluded. Kitaka was never charged. Across all documented cases, the pattern is unambiguous. Individuals who designed, conducted, supervised, or administered the killing of prisoners at Pingfong went on to build legitimate, sometimes distinguished professional careers in medicine, government, education, and commerce. They were not hunted. They published research under their real names, trained graduate students who had no idea what their supervisor's wartime service had involved, and received professional honors from institutions that never asked the right questions. In April 2018, the National Archives of Japan released a near-complete personnel roster of Unit 731, a document dated January 1, 1945, that had been in government possession for more than 7 decades without public disclosure. The roster names 3,607 members, including 52 surgeons, 49 engineers, 38 nurses, and 1,117 combat medics. The Japanese government's previous position had been that it held no such records. In 2023, researcher Seiya Matsuno found an additional and more detailed staff document in a separate archive, suggesting the 2018 release was not the complete picture. 3,607 names, dated January 1, 1945, when the unit's experimental program was at or near peak intensity. That roster had existed in government possession since at least the end of the war and was held for 73 years before anyone outside the government saw it. The men named on it spent those 73 years in a country whose government officially maintained it held no records of the unit's personnel. Some of them will have known the roster existed. Some may have known exactly where it was held. Around 1982, approximately 37 years after the program's dissolution, the Japanese government acknowledged the existence of Unit 731. The acknowledgement was minimal. The unit had existed. That was the extent of it. No concession of responsibility followed. No acknowledgement of the crimes. No compensation. No naming of victims. The 1982 acknowledgement was the government's attempt to stay ahead of a conversation that Seiichi Morimura's journalism and growing academic research were forcing into public view, to acknowledge the unit's existence in the most cost-free way possible, before accumulating evidence made a more extensive acknowledgement unavoidable. What followed was decades of institutional conflict over memory. Historian Saburo Ayanaga spent more than 30 years in legal battles against Japan's Ministry of Education over the content of school history textbooks. The ministry used its approval authority to force authors to soften, qualify, or remove references to Unit 731 and related atrocities. Ayanaga argued that this constituted government suppression of historical truth, and in 1997, the Japanese Supreme Court found that the ministry's removal of Unit 731 references from one specific textbook constituted an abuse of discretion, the strongest language the court had available. The ruling went against the ministry on that specific point. And that same year, a nationalist group called Atarashii Rikishi Kyokasho Wotsukaru Kai was producing the 2001 new history textbook, which would minimize or omit Unit 731 and the Nanjing Massacre entirely. The debate over what Japanese schoolchildren are told about the war has never fully resolved. The book that broke the public silence in Japan came from Seiichi Morimura, born in 1933, the same year the program effectively began. Starting in 1980, Morimura serialized a work called The Devil's Gluttony in the Communist Party newspaper Akahata. Published in book form by Kobunsha in 1981 and 1982, it was the first major work in Japanese to directly address Unit 731 for a popular audience, drawing on years of interviews with former unit members who, by 1980, were old enough that some of them were willing to speak. One photograph included in the book was later found to have been misattributed. It did not depict what Morimura's caption claimed. Kobunsha withdrew the publication. The book was reissued by Kadokawa in 1983 without the disputed photograph. Right-wing organizations and media used the photograph error to dismiss the entire work as fabrication and propaganda. One documented error was presented as sufficient to invalidate everything else. The core historical claims of The Devil's Gluttony, about the existence and nature of the experiments, the specific methods used, the scale of the death toll, were substantially supported by other evidence Morimura had gathered through direct testimony and documentary research. The photograph gave opponents a lever, and they used it with precision. This tactic surfaces consistently across every institutional attempt to suppress inconvenient historical truth. Identify one demonstrable factual error in a body of substantially accurate reporting, publicize the error aggressively, and use it to create permission to dismiss the account without engaging its substance. The same approach has been deployed against investigative journalism in every country that has ever tried to manage inconvenient historical memory. The error in the photograph was genuine. The conclusions about Unit 731 were also genuine. Treating one as grounds to dismiss the other is a logical step that does not hold up under scrutiny, but it holds up politically because it gives people permission not to look. On August 28, 2002, the Tokyo District Court delivered the most specific official Japanese judicial acknowledgement the program's crimes have ever received. Judge Koji Iwatake ruled for the first time that Japan had conducted biological warfare, specifically plague and typhoid attacks against Suzhou, Ningbo, and Changde between 1940 and 1942, naming the cities, naming the pathogens, and attributing the attacks to the Imperial Japanese Army. The ruling was also structurally limited. The court rejected the plaintiff's compensation claims, citing post-war treaties it found had settled war reparations between Japan and China. Survivors and their descendants were acknowledged to have been victims of state-sponsored biological warfare. Nothing was paid. That ruling came 4 days before Sheldon Harris, whose work had done more than any other single source to establish the historical record in English, died. The Harbin Museum, formerly the Exhibition Hall of Evidence of Crimes Committed by Unit 731, continues to operate under Chinese government administration, visited regularly by Chinese school groups and international tourists. The physical ruins of the Pingfang complex sit adjacent to the museum. Japan has no equivalent national memorial to the program's victims. The asymmetry in how the two nations have chosen to memorialize or not memorialize what happened at Pingfang tells its own story about the ongoing relationship between institutional memory and political will. Unit 731 and the Nazi medical experiments of World War II are the twin foundations of modern research ethics. The Nuremberg Code, produced in 1947 as a direct consequence of the Nuremberg doctors' trial, established that voluntary informed consent is the absolutely essential precondition for any human experimentation. That principle is now embedded in international law, in national medical regulations, and in the ethical frameworks governing clinical trials and drug development worldwide. 7 Nuremberg doctors were convicted. 7 were hanged. The Unit 731 scientists were not tried. Several became professors, several became pharmaceutical executives, several trained the next generation of Japanese physicians, and several died in old age with respectful obituaries in scientific journals that never asked where their most significant data came from. This is not merely a historical observation. It is a structural fact about the international framework of research ethics that governs medicine today. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964 and updated repeatedly since, built on the Nuremberg Code's consent requirements. The Belmont Report, published by the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in 1979, established the principles of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice as the ethical foundations of American research regulation. These documents are read by every researcher conducting clinical trials. They are taught in every medical ethics course. They rest on a foundation that was applied to German perpetrators and deliberately not applied to Japanese ones. Not because the crimes differed in severity, not because the evidence was less available, but because American strategic interests in the immediate post-war Pacific made accountability for the Japanese biological warfare program inconvenient. The question that bioethics literature has returned to repeatedly, without a satisfying answer, is what it means for a framework built on selective enforcement to claim universal authority. The Nuremberg Code says voluntary consent is absolutely essential. If it was absolutely essential in 1946, when the Nuremberg doctors' trial began, it was equally absolutely essential in 1947, when Edwin Hill was describing Unit 731's data as worth acquiring. The code and the cover-up were simultaneous events. The same international community that produced the Nuremberg Code produced the immunity deal. These were not contradictory impulses operating in separate institutional spaces. They operated within the same government, within the same year, under the same chain of command. The Hill-Victor Report of December 1947, the document containing Hill's statement about scruples attached to human experimentation, was classified for decades after it was submitted. When it was finally declassified, it placed in the public record a document in which a senior U.S. government scientist explicitly acknowledged that the experimental data had been produced through methods his own government's ethical standards would have prohibited, and recommended that the men responsible be protected. That document now sits in American archives. It has never generated a formal government response, an apology, or a statement of policy regarding the ethical contradiction it embodies. Ethical frameworks are only as durable as the political will to enforce them universally. When a framework is applied to enemies and suspended for useful allies, when it protects some victims and ignores others, it does not establish a principle. It establishes a precedent for selective application, and a selectively applied principle is not a principle. It is a preference dressed up as a principle to perform a function, to make the international system appear more principled than it is. That pattern surfaces across multiple domains whenever institutional accountability is applied asymmetrically. In financial regulation, it appears in the aftermath of systemic crises, where institutions whose failure would cause broader damage receive protection that smaller actors do not. In international law, it appears in the selective jurisdiction of international courts, which have tended historically to prosecute individuals from states without veto power while leaving comparable conduct by individuals from protected states unaddressed. The underlying mechanism is identical in every case. Rules enforced against the weak and suspended for the powerful do not produce justice. They produce the institutional appearance of justice, which is different in a way that matters, because the appearance is used to legitimate the system while the reality of selective enforcement continues beneath it. As of the research underlying this documentary, several matters remain formally unresolved. No formal apology for Unit 731's crimes has been issued by the Japanese government. The 2002 Tokyo District Court acknowledged that biological warfare attacks occurred, named the cities, named the pathogens, attributed the attacks to the Imperial Japanese Army, and rejected compensation. Survivors and descendants were acknowledged to have been victims of state-sponsored biological warfare. Nothing was paid. The United States government has issued no formal acknowledgement of the immunity deal. No official statement has addressed the MacArthur Cable of May 1947, the Hill-Victor Report of December 1947, or the purchase of the A, G, and Q reports with secret funds. Those approximately 1,500 pages sit in the Library of Congress, available to any researcher who requests them. They have sat there since the late 1940s. The government that acquired them has never explained, in any public statement, on what ethical basis it made the decision to acquire them. The question of whether American prisoners at the Mukden camp were deliberately infected with biological agents has not been resolved. Sheldon Harris concluded there is no substantive evidence. Linda Getz Holmes concluded a military order proves it. The archival materials that would settle the question definitively are either classified, destroyed, or have not yet been identified. The Petey Diary at the Imperial War Museum records what happened. It does not record why. The 2018 release of the 3,607 named personnel roster has produced no criminal referrals, no formal accountability processes, and no systematic public effort to trace the post-war careers and conduct of the individuals named. Most of those individuals are long dead. Some, statistically given the roster's date, may not be. In December 2024, Russian authorities released to China a new tranche of Soviet-era interrogation files from the Khabarovsk proceedings, adding materials from the Soviet investigation that had been inaccessible for decades. Those files are still being reviewed and translated. The program has not finished yielding its records, and what those records ultimately establish, and what the governments that hold portions of them choose to do with that establishment, remains open in a way that is not merely academic. These are decisions about what the historical record says and what official accountability looks like being made right now by institutions that still exist about events whose survivors, in diminishing numbers, are still alive. In September 1945, a bacteriologist from Fort Detrick arrived in Tokyo to investigate Japan's biological warfare program. His translator was a former member of the unit he was supposed to investigate. He was deceived. He recommended immunity. The recommendation was accepted. Over the following 3 years, the United States government purchased experimental data produced through the systematic murder of thousands of human beings, classified the transaction, suppressed the program from the War Crimes Tribunal it was simultaneously running in Tokyo, dismissed the Soviet trial that actually prosecuted the perpetrators as communist propaganda, and watched without intervention as the scientists responsible returned to Japanese academic, governmental, and commercial life. Men who froze children in ice water, men who infected prisoners with plague and measured how long it took their organs to fail, men who cut living people open without anesthesia and recorded the results and then published those results in journals that other doctors read. Those men received what Edwin Hill described in December 1947 as protection from embarrassment. Not from prosecution, from embarrassment. There is a version of this history that treats Unit 731 as a cautionary tale about what happens when states strip ethical constraints from scientific practice, and that version is true. There is a second version that treats the American cover-up as a Cold War calculation, a decision made by serious people under genuine strategic pressure who judged that the potential value of Japan's biological warfare data outweighed the cost of abandoning prosecution, and that version is coherent in its own terms. Cold War logic was real logic, operating in a real and dangerous environment. But there is a third version, and the third version is the one the documentary record actually supports. The same government that shielded Ishii's network from prosecution held a tribunal at Yokohama in 1948 that convicted 9 Japanese personnel for vivisecting captured American airmen at Kyushu Imperial University. 8 American airmen, the crew of a single B-29 down near Fukuoka on May 5, 1945. 9 convictions. Death sentences produced. MacArthur commuted those sentences in 1950, and the last convicts were free by 1958. But the prosecution happened. The War Crimes Tribunal for Kyushu happened. The institutional machinery of post-war accountability was made to work. The difference between the Kyushu University vivisections and the Unit 731 program was not the severity of the crime. Unit 731 killed thousands. The Kyushu vivisections killed 8. The difference was not the evidence either. The Unit 731 case had MacArthur's own cables, Fell's documented immunity promise, and Hill's written statement about scruples attached to human experimentation, evidence for the U.S. government's own complicity documented in real time, in official documents, by the people making the decisions. If anything, The evidentiary record for Unit 731 was more extensive than for Kyushu. The difference was the victims. When the victims were American, the institutional machinery moved. When the victims were Chinese, Russian, Korean, and Mongolian, and when the perpetrators held data that American military planners wanted, the machinery was quietly switched off and replaced with a transaction. That calculation is documented. The documents are public. The names on those documents belong to men who made choices in specific offices on specific dates for specific reasons. Those choices had consequences that extended for decades. The careers of the perpetrators, the profits of Green Cross, the contaminated blood products that killed Japanese hemophiliacs 40 years after the war, the single victim's name in the Tokyo trial transcript, the 3,607 name roster held in a government archive for 73 years. The question is not whether these events occurred. They occurred. The question is what it means that they did, and whether the institutions that made those choices have ever been held to account for making them. Unit 731 was not history's most hidden atrocity. It was history's most deliberately concealed one. And the concealment was not Japan's alone. The research underlying this documentary draws primarily from Sheldon Harris's Factories of Death, Tsunaishi Kiichi's research published in the Asia-Pacific Journal, the published record of the December 1949 Khabarovsk war crimes trial, the declassified Hill-Victor report of December 12, 1947, Major Robert Peaty's secret diary held at the Imperial War Museum in London, and the August 28, 2002 ruling of the Tokyo District Court, where sources conflict on numbers, and on this subject they frequently do. Those conflicts have been presented explicitly rather than resolved by selecting one source over another. The sourced ranges are the honest answer. The clean single number is the convenient one. If this documentary reached you, share it with someone it should reach.